A strange awakening, the October sunlight cut through the blinds of Jade. Montgomery's Lincoln Park apartment like accusations she wasn't ready to face. She rolled over in bed, her muscles aching in ways that suggested she'd done something far more athletic than attending a museum fundraiser. The silk champagne-colored dress from last night lay crumpled on her bedroom floor, one strap torn in a way she absolutely did not remember happening at 29. Jade had built her entire professional identity on precision and control. As the lead art conservator at the Chicago Cultural Museum, she spent her days with steady hands and focused attention, repairing centuries-old paintings with the kind of patience that bordered on meditation. Her dark brown hair was always pulled back in a practical bun. Her hazel eyes were trained to spot the smallest imperfections in brushwork or canvas texture. She was the person others relied on to be responsible, careful, and utterly predictable, which made this morning's confusion feel like waking up in someone else's life. Jade pushed herself up and immediately noticed the mark on her left shoulder. Not quite a bruise, but a definite discoloration that looked almost like a thumbprint pressed with gentle insistence. She touched it carefully. A flash of memory surfaced like a photograph developing in reverse, strong hands steadying her as she stumbled. The scent of cedar and something expensive, a deep voice saying her name like it was a secret worth keeping. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from her best friend and colleague, Whitney Park. Before she could call back, a text appeared. "Oh my God, Jade, please tell me you're alive. You disappeared with him last night, and nobody's seen you since. Call me immediately." Fragments and confusion, Jade made coffee with trembling hands, trying to reconstruct the previous evening. The museum's annual gala had been like dozens of others she'd attended. Wealthy donors in designer clothes, champagne flowing like water, conversations about acquisition budgets and exhibition schedules. She remembered wearing the champagne dress because her younger sister Myra had insisted it made her look approachable instead of invisible. She remembered talking to the museum director, Gerald Foster, about the new Renaissance collection. She remembered declining the first 3 glasses of champagne because she never drank at work events. But after that, everything became fragments. A conversation near the Monet exhibit, laughter that felt unfamiliar coming from her own throat, the sensation of feeling truly seen by someone for the first time in years, and those hands, strong and careful, touching her shoulder with a certainty that suggested permission she didn't recall giving. Whitney called before Jade could finish her first cup of coffee. Her friend's voice exploded through the speaker with barely contained excitement. "Do not even try to pretend nothing happened. I saw you leaving the restoration wing with Dominic Kane." Dominic Kane. Jade, the man who just donated $12 million to build our new contemporary art center. The man who Forbes called the most eligible bachelor in Chicago. What were you doing alone with him in a restricted area? Jade's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. The restoration wing. That was her sanctuary, the private workspace where she performed her most delicate repairs. Why would she have taken a donor there after hours? Whitney, I honestly don't remember. I remember talking to him briefly during cocktail hour, but after that everything gets fuzzy. Fuzzy? Girl, you left together at midnight. Gerald saw you getting into Kane's private car. He said you looked completely happy, like you'd forgotten the museum even had security cameras. The words hit Jade like cold water. She never left events early. She never got into cars with strangers. She absolutely never did anything that could be captured on security footage and later questioned. "I need to go," she said abruptly. "I need to figure out what happened." An unexpected visitor, the Chicago Cultural Museum occupied a massive limestone building in the Loop. Its halls filled with treasures spanning 5,000 years of human creativity. Jade normally found peace in these spaces, but today, the grand marble corridors felt like they were watching her with judgment. She went straight to her restoration studio, hoping that familiar surroundings would help shake loose whatever memories were hiding in her. Fragmented consciousness. The studio was exactly as she'd left it. Conservation tools arranged with surgical precision. Works in progress covered with protective cloths. The faint smell of linseed oil and archival paper. But sitting on her workbench was something that definitely hadn't been there. Yesterday, a single white orchid in an elegant glass vase, with a small card tucked beneath it, Her hands shook as she opened the envelope. The handwriting was bold, confident, masculine. Thank you for showing me how you see the world. Some conversations are too important to forget, even when forgetting feels safer. I hope you kept the bracelet. There was no signature, but Jade knew immediately who had sent it. She looked down at her wrist and noticed for the first time a delicate silver bracelet she absolutely had not been wearing yesterday morning. It was beautiful, almost antique in style, with tiny charms that looked like artists' tools, a miniature brush, a palette, a magnifying glass. Beautiful choice, isn't it? Jade spun around so fast she knocked over the vase. Water spread across her workbench as she stared at the man standing in her doorway. Dominic Kane looked exactly like his photographs in business magazines, but somehow more real. Tall and lean, with dark hair that was just slightly too long to be corporate. Sharp cheekbones that suggested either excellent genetics or expensive skincare. And eyes so intensely blue they seemed to see through whatever defenses she tried to construct. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd forgotten he was wealthy. "Mr. Kane," she managed, grabbing paper towels to mop up the spilled water. "I wasn't expecting you. Dominic, please. And I thought we'd moved past formality last night." He stepped into the studio, his gaze moving over her workspace with genuine interest. "You said I could stop by any time to see the Caravaggio restoration. I hope you weren't just being polite." Piecing together the night, Jade's mind raced. She'd been working on a damaged Caravaggio for 3 months. But it was confidential work, not something she discussed with donors. The fact that he knew about it meant she'd definitely told him things she shouldn't have. "I'm sorry, but I'm having trouble remembering our conversation clearly. The champagne affected me more than usual." Dominic's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "You had 2 glasses over 4 hours. Jade, you weren't drunk. You were cautious and careful and absolutely clear-headed when you asked me to follow you to your studio. I would never do that. I don't take donors to restricted areas. I don't break protocols." "Maybe the person you usually are doesn't," he said quietly, moving closer. "But last night you told me you were tired of being the person everyone expected you to be. You said you'd spent 10 years being so careful and controlled that you'd forgotten what it felt like to take risks." The words hit uncomfortably close to truths Jade had been avoiding. She'd spent her entire adult life being responsible. Being the daughter who made good choices, the employee who never caused problems, the friend who always showed up. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped asking what she actually wanted. "What else did I tell you?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Dominic reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "You asked me to take photographs? You said you wanted proof that you could be someone different, even if just for one night." He turned the screen toward her, and Jade's breath caught. The image showed her in the restoration studio, illuminated by the warm glow of her work lights. Her hair was down, falling past her shoulders in waves she never wore loose. She was smiling at the camera with unguarded joy, holding a paintbrush like it was a magic wand. And her eyes held something she barely recognized: freedom. "I look happy," she whispered. "You talked about art for 3 hours straight. You showed me conservation techniques and explained why touching something beautiful changes a person. You said that restoration wasn't just about preserving objects. It was about preserving the moments when humans created something meaningful out of nothing." Jade stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the woman in the image with the person she thought she was. "Why can't I remember saying any of this?" "Memory is complicated," Dominic said, his voice gentle. "Sometimes when we experience something that challenges our sense of self, our mind protects us by making it feel distant, dreamlike. But Jade, I promise you, we're completely present. You weren't impaired or confused. You were just finally letting yourself be honest." The offer before Jade could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent call from Gerald Foster. The museum director's voice was tight with barely controlled excitement when she answered. "Jade, I need you in my office immediately. Mr. Kane has made an extraordinary proposal regarding your Caravaggio restoration, and it involves opportunities that could transform your entire career." She looked at Dominic, who was watching her with an expression that suggested he knew exactly what Foster was about to offer. What did you do? She asked after hanging up. I made a business proposition. The Caravaggio you're working on is the centerpiece of what could be a groundbreaking exhibition on Italian Baroque restoration techniques. I want to fund the entire project, with you as the lead curator and conservator. That would cost millions. Why would you invest in something like that? Dominic stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, that cedar scent from her fragmented memories. Because last night you told me about your dream of creating an exhibition that showed art conservation as an art form itself. You said the world treated restoration like technical work, but it was actually an intimate conversation between past and present. You described it so passionately that I stayed up until dawn researching conservation practices just so I could understand what you were talking about. Jade's heart hammered against her ribs. A project like this was everything she'd ever wanted professionally. But accepting it meant accepting that whatever happened between them last night had been real, significant, and impossible to dismiss. I don't understand why you're doing this. You don't know me, don't I? His blue eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity. I know you've spent your entire life being careful because you watched your father lose everything taking risks. I know you became a conservator because fixing broken things felt safer than creating new ones. I know you're terrified right now because everything about last night contradicts the story you tell yourself about who you are. The accuracy of his observations felt like being stripped bare. How could I have told you all that? Because sometimes the right person asks the right questions at the right time, and all those carefully guarded truths just spill out. He paused, then added softly, and because you trusted me, even if you can't remember why. Jade looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, at the tiny artist's tools that suggested someone had actually listened to what mattered to her. This is moving too fast. I need time to think. Take all the time you need, Dominic said, though something in his expression suggested patience wasn't his strongest quality. But Jade, whatever you're afraid of discovering about yourself, I promise it's not as dangerous as spending the rest of your life wondering what you might have become if you'd been brave enough to remember. As he walked away, leaving her alone with spilled water and an orchid and questions that had no easy answers, Jade realized that the mark on her shoulder wasn't the only evidence that something had changed. The woman in those photographs had made choices the old Jade never would have considered. The only question now was whether she had the courage to become that person again, this time with full awareness of what she was risking. The decision Jade spent the next 2 hours sitting in Gerald Foster's office, listening to details about an opportunity that sounded too perfect to be real. The proposed exhibition would span 6 months, featuring 12 major Baroque masterpieces undergoing restoration. She would have complete creative control, a team of 5 assistants, and a budget that made her current resources look like pocket change. This is unprecedented, Gerald said, his silver beard practically quivering with excitement. Mr. Kane's foundation wants to partner with us to create something that will put Chicago on the map for art conservation. But Jade, he specifically requested that you lead the project. He won't move forward with anyone else. The implications weren't lost on her. Dominic Kane had essentially bought her a dream job, and the professional in her knew that accepting it would tie their lives together for at least the next year. The cautious part of her brain screamed warnings about mixing personal connections with career advancement. Can I have 24 hours to consider? She asked. Gerald's expression flickered with concern. Of course, but Jade, opportunities like this don't come twice. Whatever happened between you and Mr. Kane at the gala, he clearly sees something exceptional in your work. Walking back to her studio, Jade felt like she was moving through water. Everything seemed distorted, unfamiliar. She'd spent a decade building a reputation based on careful scholarship and meticulous technique. Now a man she barely remembered meeting was offering to catapult her into a position that usually took 20 years to achieve. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dominic.
Oh.
I know you're questioning my motives. Meet me for coffee, and I'll answer every question honestly. The Brew Lab, 4 p.m. I promise this isn't about control or obligation. It's about recognizing talent that deserves recognition. Secrets in the shadows, the Brew Lab was a tiny coffee shop tucked between skyscrapers. The kind of place where serious conversations happened away from watching eyes. Jade arrived 10 minutes early. Ordering a cappuccino she barely tasted while rehearsing the professional boundary speech she'd prepared. Dominic appeared exactly at 4. Still wearing his business suit, but with his tie loosened in a way that made him look more human, less intimidating. He ordered black coffee and sat across from her with the focused attention that made everything else fade into background noise. "Before you start listing all the reasons this is complicated," he said, "let me tell you what really happened last night." Jade wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, bracing herself. "You didn't just show me your studio. You showed me a painting that's been troubling you for weeks, a supposed Rembrandt portrait that's part of the Vanderbilt collection we're preparing for loan to the museum." Her breath caught. The Vanderbilt Rembrandt was one of the most anticipated pieces in their upcoming Dutch Masters exhibition. She'd been conducting routine authentication analysis. "Standard procedure for any major loan?" "Haven't finished my report on that piece," she said. "Carefully, because you've discovered something that could destroy the exhibition and embarrass one of our most important donors." Dominic's blue eyes were serious now, all traces of charm replaced by sharp intelligence. "You told me last night that you're 90% certain the Rembrandt is a forgery. An excellent forgery, probably 19th century, but not authentic." Jade felt the blood drain from her face. That assessment was locked in her private research files, shared with absolutely no one. The implications of a fake Rembrandt in the Vanderbilt collection would be catastrophic. Not just for the museum, but for the entire art world. It would trigger authentication reviews of dozens of other pieces, shake collector confidence, and potentially expose a fraud network that had operated for over a century. "I never should have told you that. That information is confidential until I complete my analysis. You told me because you were scared, because someone had already approached you about changing your findings." The room seemed to tilt. "How do you know that?" Dominic pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph she definitely didn't remember him taking. It showed a business card lying on her workbench. Trevor Walsh, independent art consultant. On the back, in her own handwriting, was a phone number, and the words offered $50,000 to authenticate without question. "You said this Walsh person cornered you at the gala. Told you that disappointing the Vanderbilt family would end your career before it started. You were terrified, not because of the threat, but because you realized the forgery might be connected to something much bigger." The Breckenjade's hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. "I don't remember any of this. Why would I tell you these things?" "I don't know you, because I told you something first," Dominic said quietly. "I told you that 3 years ago, I bought a Vermeer from a private collection for $8 million. 2 years later, I discovered it was fake. The embarrassment, the financial loss, that was manageable. What haunted me was knowing that somewhere in the authentication chain, experts had either been fooled or paid off. I've been quietly investigating art fraud ever since." The revelation shifted something in Jade's understanding. "So this exhibition offer, your interest in conservation, it's all about the forgery investigation?" "No." His response was immediate and forceful. "My interest in you has nothing to do with the Rembrandt. But when you trusted me with your concerns last night, I realized we might be able to help each other. You need protection and resources to properly investigate this forgery. I need someone with your expertise and integrity to help uncover a fraud network that's been operating in plain sight for decades." Before Jade could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her apartment building's security desk. "Oh, Miss Montgomery? This is Ramon at the front desk. I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been an incident in your apartment. The police are here. You need to come home immediately." The coffee shop fell away as panic surged through her system. "What kind of incident?" "A break-in. Your door was forced open. The officers need to speak with you about what might be missing." Dangerous connections. 20 minutes later, Jade stood in her ransacked apartment, watching police officers document what looked like a tornado's aftermath. Every drawer had been emptied, every cabinet opened, papers scattered across every surface. But it wasn't random destruction. Whoever had done this had been searching for something specific. Officer Patricia Reeves, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, walked Jade through the damage. Your laptop is still here, jewelry untouched, television and electronics all present. This wasn't a typical burglary. Can you think of anything someone might want badly enough to risk breaking in during daylight hours? Jade's research files? Her authentication notes on the Rembrandt? The preliminary spectroscopy results that proved the painting's pigments were inconsistent with 17th century materials? I'm an art conservator, she said carefully. I work with valuable pieces. Maybe someone thought I had information about museum security? Officer Reeves didn't look convinced, but before she could press further, Dominic appeared in the doorway. He must have followed her from the coffee shop, and the sight of him made Jade feel both relieved and more frightened. This was really happening. The threats were real. Ms. Montgomery, do you know this man? Officer Reeves asked. I'm Dominic Kane, he said, pulling out identification with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being recognized. I'm a major donor to the Chicago Cultural Museum where Ms. Montgomery works. I'm also her friend, and I'd like to help ensure her safety. The word friend hung in the air like a question Jade wasn't ready to answer. But when Dominic's eyes met hers across the destroyed apartment, she saw genuine concern mixed with determination. It's Montgomery, Officer Reeves said. Is there anything you're not telling me? Because this break-in has all the hallmarks of someone searching for specific documents or files. If you're involved in something that's putting you at risk, we need to know. Jade looked at the ruins of her carefully organized life. Every instinct screamed to maintain control, to handle this professionally and privately. But the woman in those photographs, the one who trusted Dominic with dangerous secrets, understood something important. Some situations were too big to face alone. I think I might have information about art fraud, she said quietly, and I think someone is willing to hurt me to keep that information hidden. Protection and promises 2 hours later. After giving a statement and watching the police process her apartment as a crime scene, Jade found herself in Dominic's penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. The space was modern and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city look like scattered jewels in the darkness. You can stay here as long as you need, Dominic said, showing her to a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment. I have excellent security, and my building has protocols that will make it very difficult for anyone to access you without permission. Jade sank onto the bed, exhausted and overwhelmed. This is insane. 24 hours ago, my biggest concern was meeting a conservation deadline. Now I'm hiding in a billionaire's apartment because someone broke into my home searching for evidence of art fraud. Dominic sat in the chair across from her, maintaining a careful distance that suggested he understood how fragile her composure was. I know this is terrifying. But Jade, you stumbled onto something that could expose corruption worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The people involved won't stop just because you're scared. So what am I supposed to do? I can't just hide here forever. I have a job, a life. You continue your work on the Rembrandt authentication, but with resources and protection. I have investigators, security experts, legal counsel. We can do this properly, safely, and we can make sure that when you present your findings, they're backed by evidence that can't be dismissed or suppressed. Jade studied his face, searching for hidden motives. Why are you really doing this? And don't tell me it's just about recovering from your Vermeer purchase. Nobody invests this much time and money in someone they met once at a fundraiser. Dominic was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes reflecting the city lights. You want complete honesty? Fine. When you showed me that painting last night and explained your concerns, I saw someone with the kind of integrity that's rare in any field but almost non-existent in the art world. You were willing to risk your career to tell the truth about a forgery, even knowing it could destroy you professionally. He leaned forward, his intensity making the large room feel suddenly small. My mother spent her entire life in the art world. She was a curator like you. She discovered fraud in her museum's collection and tried to report it. They destroyed her reputation, blacklisted her from every major institution. She died believing that honesty in the art world was a fairy tale. His voice roughened with emotion. So yes, maybe I'm investing too much too quickly. But when I see someone who reminds me of her, Someone with that same commitment to truth? I'm not going to let her fight that battle alone. The raw honesty in his words stripped away Jade's remaining defenses. This wasn't about attraction or manipulation. It was about shared values and old wounds, and the possibility that two damaged people might be able to protect each other from forces they couldn't face alone. Okay, she said quietly. We do this together. But I need you to understand something. I don't remember what I told you last night, what promises I might have made. I'm agreeing to this collaboration as a professional partnership, not because of some connection I can't recall. Fair enough, Dominic said, standing and moving toward the door. Though Jade, for what it's worth, that connection wasn't something you imagined. It was real, and I think part of you knows that, even if you can't remember the specifics. After he left, Jade sat alone in the luxury guest room, staring at the bracelet still circling her wrist. Outside the windows, Chicago glittered with possibility and danger in equal measure. Somewhere in that city, people were willing to break laws and threaten lives to protect secrets worth millions, and she'd just agreed to expose them, trusting a man whose kiss she couldn't remember, but whose presence made her feel safer than she'd felt in years. The old Jade would have called this reckless. But maybe the woman in those photographs understood something the careful conservator had forgotten. Sometimes the only way to preserve what matters is to risk everything to protect it. The investigation begins. Morning came with weak, its autumn sunlight filtering through unfamiliar windows. Jade woke, disoriented, taking several seconds to remember she was in Dominic's guest room, protected from whoever had torn apart her apartment. She found coffee waiting in the kitchen, along with a note in that confident handwriting. Meeting with investigators at 10. Take your time. Everything you need is here. She showered and dressed in clothes that had been retrieved from her apartment by Dominic's security team, trying not to think too hard about how quickly her carefully independent life had been absorbed into his world. By 9:30, she was sitting in his home office, surrounded by three people who looked like they'd stepped from a corporate thriller. Patricia. Nguyen was a former FBI art crimes investigator with sharp eyes and sharper questions. Marcus Webb handled private security with the quiet competence of someone who'd seen actual combat. And James Rothstein was an art historian whose credentials made Jade feel like an amateur. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with, Patricia said, spreading photographs across Dominic's conference table. The Vanderbilt Rembrandt isn't the only questionable piece in their collection. We've identified at least 6 other works with authentication issues. Together, they're worth over $200 million. Jade stared at the images. A supposed Caravaggio with incorrect canvas weave, a Vermeer with pigment analysis suggesting 20th century materials, a Raphael drawing with paper that hadn't existed during the Renaissance. How is this possible? These pieces have been in the Vanderbilt family for generations. They've been examined by dozens of experts. That's exactly what makes it possible, James said, his British accent making the explanation sound almost academic. When a piece has impeccable provenance and has been accepted as authentic for decades, nobody questions it closely. Authentication becomes about confirming what everyone already believes rather than genuine investigation. But somebody would have to be forging documents, bribing experts, maybe even replacing original works with copies. Jade's mind raced through the logistics. That's not one person. That's an organization. Precisely, Patricia said. And we believe Trevor Walsh, the man who approached you at the gala, is just one small piece of a network that's been operating since at least the 1970s. They identify wealthy collectors with impressive but poorly documented pieces, create authentication trails that look legitimate, and profit every time the art changes hands. Marcus pulled up security footage on his laptop. This is from the museum 2 nights ago, after the gala. Watch the time stomp around midnight. Jade watched herself leaving the restoration wing with Dominic, exactly as Whitney had described. But Marcus fast-forwarded to 30 minutes later, showing a different figure entering the same restricted area. Even on grainy security footage, the person's movements were purposeful, methodical. That's Trevor Walsh, Patricia said. He accessed your studio using a copied keycard. Spent 20 minutes inside, probably photographing your research notes. That's why he approached you at the gala, Dominic added, appearing in the doorway with fresh coffee. He needed to assess how much you suspected and whether you could be bought or intimidated. When you refused his offer, he decided to steal your findings instead. But I changed my passwords after the gala, Jade protested. My digital files are encrypted, which is probably why they broke into your apartment, Marcus said grimly. They're looking for physical notes, preliminary findings, anything that might tell them how much evidence you've actually compiled. The proposal, the weight of the situation pressed down on Jade like physical force. So what do? If I release my authentication report, they'll claim it's biased or incompetent. If I stay silent, I'm complicit in fraud that's worth hundreds of millions. Patricia leaned forward, her expression intense. We do what they're not expecting. We build an airtight case against the entire network. We document every suspicious authentication, trace the money flow, identify everyone who's been part of this fraud chain. Then we go public with everything at once, in a way that can't be dismissed or suppressed. That could take months, Jade said. Maybe years. And in the meantime, I'm supposed to just continue working at the museum like nothing's wrong? No, Dominic said quietly. In the meantime, you accept my exhibition offer and use it as cover for a much deeper investigation. We bring in pieces from collections worldwide for your restoration showcase. You examine each one thoroughly, documenting everything with cutting-edge technology. Any forgeries you discover become part of the evidence trail. Jade stared at him, understanding dawning. You want to turn the exhibition into a fraud investigation. I want to turn it into the most comprehensive authentication review the art world has ever seen, he corrected. Completely legitimate, academically rigorous, beyond reproach. And when it's finished, we'll have evidence that will force institutions worldwide to re-examine their collections and their authentication processes. That's brilliant, James said with obvious admiration. Use legitimate scholarship to expose fraud that's been hiding behind legitimate scholarship for decades. But Jade was shaking her head. You're asking me to lie to my colleagues, to the museum board, to every institution that loans us pieces for the exhibition? You're asking me to pretend I'm creating an art showcase when I'm actually conducting a criminal investigation. No, Patricia corrected gently. We're asking you to be the conservator you already are. You'll examine every piece with the same rigor you bring to all your work. The only difference is that this time, when you find problems, you'll have the resources and protection to report them honestly. The threat escalates before Jade could respond. Marcus's phone buzzed with an alert. His expression darkened as he read the message. We have a problem. Someone just posted bail for Trevor Walsh. He was arrested yesterday on an unrelated warrant, but he's back on the street as of 30 minutes ago. Dominic's expression hardened. Increase security protocols. I want eyes on him 24/7. There's more, Marcus continued. We've been monitoring Walsh's communications. 20 minutes ago, he received a message that reads, "Handle the Montgomery situation permanently. No more warnings." The room fell silent. Jade felt cold spread through her chest, making it hard to breathe. They're threatening to kill me over a painting. Not over a painting, Patricia said grimly. Over $200 million in fraudulent art and the reputation of some of the wealthiest families in America, people have died for far less. Jade stood abruptly, needing to move. To do something other than sit still while strangers discussed threats against her life. She walked to the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Pressing her palm against the glass like she could push through to the normal world that had existed. Just 2 days ago, she felt Dominic approach before he spoke. His presence radiating that same steady certainty that had made her trust him with secrets she couldn't even remember sharing. I know you're scared, he said quietly. I know this is bigger and more dangerous than anything you signed up for. If you want to walk away, if you want to complete your Rembrandt authentication quietly and let someone else fight this battle, I'll make sure you're protected. No judgment, no pressure. Jade turned to face him, studying the man who'd somehow become the center of her rapidly transforming life. And if I do walk away, what happens to the investigation? What happens to all the other conservators and curators who might discover fraud and face the same threats? Then nothing changes, Dominic admitted. The network continues operating. More forgeries enter circulation. More people are intimidated into silence. That's not really offering me a choice, Jade said, though there was no accusation in her voice. Just tired acceptance of a truth she'd known since the moment she'd seen her ransacked apartment. Some things were too important to walk away from. Even when walking away would be safer. The memory returns that evening. After hours of strategy discussions and security briefings, Jade found herself alone in Dominic's library. The room was filled with art books, many of them the same obscure conservation texts she owned. She was flipping through a volume on Baroque restoration techniques when a photograph slipped from between the pages. It was her, from the gala night. But not one of the images Dominic had shown her before. In this shot, she was looking up at him while he took the picture. The expression on her face was unguarded, vulnerable, and utterly happy. She was clearly mid-laugh, and her hand was reaching toward the camera like she was about to push it away. The photograph triggered something. Suddenly, the missing memories rushed back like a dam breaking. She remembered Dominic asking about her work with a genuine curiosity that made her forget to be cautious. She remembered talking for hours about pigment analysis and canvas restoration, and he'd listened like every word mattered. She remembered showing him the Rembrandt and explaining her suspicions. And instead of dismissing her concerns or suggesting she ignore them, he'd ask careful questions that helped her think through the implications. And she remembered the moment when conversation had shifted into something else. When he'd looked at her and said, "You're the most interesting person I've met in 5 years." When she'd laughed and replied, "You just enjoy talking about 400-year-old paint." When he'd stepped closer and said, "No, I enjoy talking to someone who sees beauty in preservation, who understands that sometimes the most important art isn't creating something new, but protecting what already exists." She remembered how her heart had raced, how she'd thought that maybe, just maybe, she could be brave enough to let someone see the person behind her professional walls. Jade was still holding the photograph. When Dominic entered the library, he stopped when he saw her expression. "Remember," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I remember that I kissed you first," she whispered. "I remember that you asked if I was sure, and I told you I'd never been more sure of anything. I remember feeling like I'd finally found someone who understood that being careful doesn't mean being afraid. It means caring enough to preserve what matters." Dominic crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just close enough that she could see the emotion in his blue eyes. "I didn't tell you before because I wanted you to make your choice about the investigation without feeling obligated by what happened between us. But Jade, everything I said that night was true. You are extraordinary, and I meant what I said about protecting you." "I know," she said simply. "I also know that you're right about the exhibition. If I'm going to expose this fraud network, I need to do it in a way that's beyond reproach. I need to use my expertise and reputation to force the art world to confront truths it's been ignoring for decades." To the exhibition, to the investigation, to all of it, Jade looked down at the bracelet still circling her wrist, at the tiny artist's tools that represented everything she valued. Then she looked back at Dominic, at the man who'd somehow seen past her careful defenses to recognize the person she'd been too scared to become. "I'm saying yes to doing work that matters, even when it's dangerous. I'm saying yes to trusting you, even though everything in my careful life tells me that's reckless. And I'm saying yes to investigating this fraud network because someone has to. And apparently, that someone is me." The commitment. Dominic smiled, the expression transforming his face from intimidating to almost boyish. "For what it's worth, I think you're the bravest person I've ever met." "I'm terrified," Jade admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing the right thing anyway." He paused, then asked carefully, "And what about us? What happened between us that night?" Jade thought about the careful life she'd built, about the walls she'd constructed to keep herself safe from risk and vulnerability. Then she thought about the woman in those photographs, who'd been brave enough to laugh without restraint and trust without guarantee. "I think," she said slowly, "that maybe the person I was that night is who I've always wanted to be. Someone brave enough to take risks for things that matter, Someone honest enough to admit when I need help. And someone open enough to let someone in, even when it's terrifying. She stepped closer to Dominic. Close enough to see the pulse beating at his throat. Close enough to catch his cedar scent that had haunted her fragmented memories. So I'm saying yes to that too. To us, to whatever this becomes. But Dominic, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this investigation because of you or for you. I'm doing it because it's right. If you're looking for someone who'll put you first ahead of everything else, you're going to be disappointed. Good, he said, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contradicted his intensity. I don't want someone who makes me their entire world. I want someone who has her own purpose, her own integrity, her own reasons for fighting battles that matter. I want exactly who you are. When he kissed her, it was different from the fragments she'd remembered. It was careful and questioning and full of promise. It tasted like trust and risk and the possibility that two people could be stronger together than apart. When they finally separated, Jade rested her forehead against his chest. Listening to his heartbeat and thinking about everything that was about to change, "This is going to be complicated," she murmured. "Everything worthwhile is," Dominic replied, his arms solid and secure around her. 6 months later, the exhibition opening was everything Jade had imagined and more. 12 major Baroque masterpieces displayed in revolutionary restoration settings that let viewers see conservation in action. Interactive displays explaining authentication techniques. Educational programs that demystified art analysis for general audiences, but the real story was unfolding in carefully prepared press packets, being distributed to art critics and journalists worldwide. Documentation of 17 authenticated forgeries worth over $300 million. Evidence trails showing how a fraud network had operated for nearly 50 years. Testimony from conservators who'd been threatened into silence until Dominic's foundation provided protection and resources. The Vanderbilt Rembrandt sat in a special display with a detailed explanation of the authentication process that had revealed it as a masterful 19th century copy. Standing beside it was a photograph of the original, destroyed in a fire in 1834, and an explanation of how grief-stricken descendants had likely commissioned the copy and then, over generations, convinced themselves it was authentic. Jade stood beside Dominic, watching museum directors and collectors process information that would reshape the art world. She saw shock, anger, denial. But she also saw recognition, acceptance, and finally relief that someone had been brave enough to tell difficult truths. "You did it," Dominic said quietly, his hand finding hers. "You changed everything." "We did it," Jade corrected. "I couldn't have exposed the network without your resources and protection. And I wouldn't have had the courage to try without knowing someone believed in me." Gerald Foster approached, looking older than he had 6 months ago, but also strangely relieved. "Jade, I won't lie. Part of me wishes you'd never discovered any of this. But another part, the part that became a curator because I believed in truth and scholarship, is incredibly proud of what you've accomplished." "I'm sorry if this causes problems for the museum," Jade said sincerely. "Problems?" Gerald almost laughed. "My dear, you've positioned us as the institution brave enough to prioritize authenticity over prestige. Our credibility just skyrocketed. Though I suspect your future involves far more than our humble museum can offer." He was right. Jade had already received offers from 3 major institutions wanting her to direct their authentication programs. Universities wanted her to teach conservation ethics. Even Interpol had reached out about consulting on art fraud cases. But as she stood in the gallery, surrounded by restored masterpieces and exposed frauds, watching the art world reckon with uncomfortable truths, Jade realized something important. The careful, controlled life she'd built had been safe, but it had also been small. The woman she'd become, the one brave enough to risk everything for integrity, occupied a much larger and more meaningful space in the world. "What are you thinking?" Dominic asked, noting her distant expression. "That I spent 10 years being scared to take risks. Scared to trust people. Scared to be vulnerable. And it took a night I couldn't remember, and a billionaire who wouldn't let me hide to show me that the most dangerous choice is playing it safe. Do you regret it? Any of it? Jade looked at the mark on her shoulder, faded now, but still visible. A reminder of the night when everything had changed. Then she looked at Dominic, at the man who'd seen her potential before she recognized it herself. No, she said firmly. I regret all the years I wasted being someone smaller than I needed to be. But everything from that night forward, that's the life I was meant to be living all along. The exhibition would run for 6 months, drawing visitors from around the world. The fraud investigation would continue for years, unraveling networks that stretched across continents. And Jade's career would take her places she'd never imagined. 2 challenges that would test everything she'd learned about courage and integrity. But tonight, standing beside Dominic in the gallery they'd created together, looking at art that told the truth about both beauty and deception, Jade Montgomery felt something she'd never experienced in her carefully controlled existence. She felt free, and that freedom, purchased with risk and trust and the willingness to become someone new, was more valuable than any masterpiece hanging on any museum wall. Epilogue. The package arrived at Jade's new office at the Chicago Cultural Museum 3 months after the exhibition closed. Inside was a small painting, no larger than a piece of paper, depicting water lilies on a pond. The style was clearly impressionist, and the technique was breathtaking. The note attached read, "Found this in my grandmother's attic. Given everything you've done to expose art fraud, I thought you'd be the right person to authenticate it. It's been in our family since 1923. My great-grandfather said he bought it directly from an old French painter who was selling work to pay medical bills. Worth looking at? Sincerely, Christine Beaumont." Jade studied the painting under magnification, her trained eye noting the precise brushwork, the authentic aging of the canvas, the pigments consistent with early 20th century materials. Her heart raced as she recognized Signature's techniques. She'd spent years studying. She pulled out her phone and called Dominic. "Remember how you said uncovering fraud would be rewarding? I think I just discovered something that's going to make the Rembrandt investigation look simple." "Another forgery?" he asked. "No," Jade said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. "I think this might be an actual lost Monet. And if I'm right, there's a very happy family about to discover they've had a masterpiece in their attic for 100 years. Dominic's laugh was warm with affection. "Only you would find this more exciting than exposing a fraud network." "That's because this is what conservation is really about," Jade replied, still studying the luminous water lilies. "Not just protecting what we know is valuable, but discovering beauty that's been hidden, forgotten, or overlooked. This is why I became a curator." "Should I schedule more investigators?" "Definitely. And Dominic, thank you for pushing me to become the kind of person who gets excited about authentication mysteries instead of terrified by them. You for showing me that sometimes the most valuable discoveries aren't paintings or sculptures. Sometimes they're people brave enough to see truth and strong enough to protect it, no matter the cost." As Jade hung up and returned to examining the potential Monet, she thought about the mark that had started everything. A simple bruise that had led to recovered memories, exposed frauds, and a completely transformed life. She'd learned that sometimes losing control meant gaining everything that mattered. That trust was terrifying but essential. That the safest choice was often the most dangerous one. And she'd learned that love, a real love, looked like someone believing in your potential even when you couldn't see it yourself. Someone standing beside you while you fought battles that mattered. Someone celebrating your victories and supporting you through failures. The careful conservator, who'd woken up confused and frightened, was gone. In her place was a woman who understood that the most important restoration project was often ourselves, rebuilding from fear into courage, from isolation into connection, from safety into purpose. And that transformation, more than any masterpiece she would ever authenticate or restore, was the most valuable work of art Jade Montgomery would ever create.